Over the next couple of minutes, I want to share some of my thoughts about the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and I'm delighted to have this opportunity to do so. Although these are indeed momentous times where the unimaginable seems to happen on the regular, it's important, I think, that we take a moment to pause and remember the legacy that Dr. King left behind and recognize that his counsel is probably even more important today than it's been in quite a while. Just a few weeks ago, we were solidly immersed in the year 2020, a year I, like so many of you, will likely never forget. A year where a global pandemic decimated economies and killed hundreds of thousands, as well as infected tens of millions. A year where there was a national reckoning around the impact of racism in our country, evidencing a sharp and often, too often, deadly divide amongst us. Many of us have been enveloped in darkness and felt its cold, angry, lasting effect on our lives. And yet we've also witnessed a tremendous well of compassion, sacrifice, and acts of bravery that remind us that we are not alone and all is not lost. Strangers have done amazing and selfless things to support one another because they could, not simply hiding behind the adage, "Not my issue." You see, at his core, Dr. King believed that darkness can never drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate, he said, cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. And bearing that in mind as we celebrate his birthday, there are choices to be made. We can cling to the memories of hurt and harm and allow those to define us and, in effect, become our legacy. We can choose love, truth, kindness, and forgiveness to stretch, grow, and knit ourselves into a community that is truly undivided. Now, Dr. King chose the more difficult path, to love those who persecuted him and sought him harm. He chose to speak truth to power, even suffering horrific consequences. He chose a legacy of life and love, a sacrifice we can never allow to have been made in vain. So today, as we celebrate Dr. King, I can't think of a more fitting salute than one that recognizes his warm embrace of light, love, understanding that reconciliation and forgiveness are within our reach. I hope you will join me in continuing on that journey.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., time and time again, commented on the power of silence and inaction. If 2020 taught us anything, it's that now is not the time for silence. Dr. King said, "Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. And there are countless revolutions happening around us right now in our lifetime that this applies to. Whether you are passionate about police brutality, mass incarceration, domestic violence, or our current health crisis, there is a movement that needs you to be a part of it. What I hope we reflect upon today, that now is not the time to stand back and watch. We each hold talents and gifts that make us powerful, and if we all use that to create change, a better world is not hard to imagine." So I encourage you to reflect on how far we've come since Dr. King's initial calls for progress, how far we have to go before we live in a truly just society, and how you can help us work towards that by not being silent.
As I reflect upon the work of Dr. Martin Luther King, I think about the strength and courage he showed in the face of adversity. His adversity, the prison time, the violence, the death threats, never stopped him from fighting for what's right. Although I may never face the same adversity that Dr. King did, I hope that I can take the same courage and apply it to the adversity that myself and others face today. Living in fear is not what Dr. King wanted, evident through his life. He wanted to empower future generations to dictate their own lives instead of living in fear of others. When I think about my experiences at the University of Richmond, I often am left pondering about how I can change this campus to empower others in hopes of carrying on Dr. King's legacy. By establishing a syllabus statement on addressing microaggressions to working on a new peer-to-peer initiative to help those that are impacted by bias incidents, I hope that I can continue Dr. King's work. Thank you, Dr. Martin Luther King, for empowering myself and others. And to all of you, happy MLK Day.
Hi everyone, my name is Shira Greer, and as a member of the Africana Studies Student Committee, Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy inspires me to challenge the status quo to help create a world where not simply equality, but justice is the norm. I think that as college students with access to the privilege of higher education, it is our duty to take ownership over our learning and find ways to use what we learn in the classroom to leave each place life takes us better than we found it. That's why much of my recent advocacy has centered around creating an Africana Studies program at UR, because it is imperative that students have a space to engage with the creation of new knowledges that promote justice and hope as a means of effecting change. To paraphrase King, our intelligence is nothing without character, and we must always make sure that the education we are receiving is one that shapes us into citizens who are ready to stand against injustice and create the better world we know is possible.
I first learned about Dr. King in the kindergarten or first grade. And at this point, I remember that my teachers told me he was this really powerful leader, orator, and activist for social change. But at the same time, they told me that he was killed for doing just that, for fighting for what he believed in. And this was something that was really difficult for my young Black brain to comprehend, knowing that fighting for what was right could cost me my life. But that being said, the thing that has continued to make me feel so determined to fight for social justice and to always seek truth and justice is Dr. King's message that, the respect and dignity of human life, of all life, is paramount. And this is something that is so inspiring to me, helps me get through each day. And I want to take this time to thank Dr. King for his endless sacrifices, and also the women and girls who did that revolutionary work to afford me the privileges I have today.
Hello, my name is Craig Coker. I'm the university chaplain. And when I think of the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., I think of the legacy of his faith, a faith that was deeply rooted in his own religious story, and yet expansive and welcoming of all those who followed different sacred journeys. A faith that was nurtured in a quiet prayer life and lived out in tangible actions for social justice in the world. A faith that had a vision of society where all would have enough and enough would satisfy, where each person was seen as a person of profound sacred worth, and where the dignity of each individual was affirmed. And a faith that saw as the moral standard of any society or any community that of how we treat the least of those in our midst. This is a legacy that I'm grateful for, and a legacy that I pray that we all might find a way to live up to.
Hi, my name is Michael Shaw. I'm a junior here at the University of Richmond. And what Dr. King represents for me is the unwavering fortitude that is necessary for a revolutionary people to create a world in which there is no racial, gender, or sexual discrimination, and where mass economic inequalities can be mitigated. It was in spirit of this uncompromising dedication towards ensuring basic human rights for societies marginalized that pushed my peers and myself to advocate for an Africana Studies program, so that Eurocentric epistemologies can be decentered in order for Black and other disenfranchised people's histories to be read from their own perspectives. King's vision of a harmonious society should not be one that we passively discuss, parade around, and sadly lose sight of once his day is over. It should be one that is fought for on a daily basis with the goal of making society better and more responsive to the needs of those suffering the most on its margins.
On April 3rd, 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his final speech. In it, he proclaimed to the entire world that God had allowed him to go up to the mountain and that he had looked over and he had seen the promised land. He said that he might not get there with us, but that we as a people would get to the promised land. His words were almost prophetic, because a few hours after he said those words, he was assassinated at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. Living so close to Memphis, I've been fortunate enough to be able to visit the Civil Rights Museum they built there. It's a surreal experience, standing, looking up at the balcony where they've placed a wreath in the last place that Dr. King ever stood. It's almost as if he knew that his time was coming. I think about that a lot, actually. I think about how every day we are still fighting to gain an inch on the way up that mountaintop that Dr. King described.
Growing up in Atlanta, I've always been inspired by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. When I was little, I would go to the King Center in downtown with my family, and also on field trips with my school. And I've always been interested in the concept of civil disobedience and peaceful protests ever since my grandma would read me stories as a kid. And one of my favorite experiences learning more about that is when my middle school took a trip to Selma, Alabama, and we walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and just learned more about what really happened there on Bloody Sunday. One of my favorite quotes from Dr. King is from a 1965 speech where he said, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." And that quote has definitely lost no relevance in going into 2021 because of the current events of police brutality and overall injustice.
Hi, my name is Kayla Corbin, and I'm a senior at the University of Richmond. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has taught so much to so many generations about liberation and ideas of freedom. We are forever indebted for his contributions to the Black radical tradition and his contributions to so many people on their ideas of peace, on their ideas of brotherhood and sisterhood and togetherness. And my biggest takeaway from Martin Luther King Jr.'s work is ideas of collectivism. He always said that this could not be done by an individual, but that it takes the collective and it takes everybody to really think about what total liberation will look like for all peoples. So I would like to thank him for his work. And as a member of the Africana Studies Student Committee, I know that his contributions were incomparable to my field and to so many others. So thank you.
Hey everyone, my name is Josh Higdon. I use they, them pronouns, and I really quickly wanted to talk about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his legacy. So all throughout grade school, I was taught about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And this has really shaped the way that I see the world. It's really inspired me to fight to ensure that people are not prejudged based on the color of their skin or on any identity that they hold, but rather to fight to ensure that people and their identities are respected and seen and valued. And this view of equity and respect has really shaped some of the opportunities that I pursue here at UR, whether it's LGBTQIA+ Coalition, or whether it is working on the Equity Summit to ensure that all of us on campus are seen and respected and valued based on the content of our character and our hearts, not prejudged based on our identities. So thank you so much for listening.
The messages of hope, of possibility, and of vision, as exemplified in Dr. King's August 1963 "I Have a Dream" speech, have long resonated with me. But now it is his words from the April 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail that feel most relevant. In response to his fellow clergymen, who issued a call for unity a few days prior, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. lamented the white moderate more devoted to order than to justice, and praise those who recognize the urgency of the moment and sense the need for powerful action antidotes to combat the disease of segregation. Dr. King knew that the remedy for racial injustice didn't involve a disingenuous call for unity or negative peace. True healing required and still requires justice. So as I think about the revolution then and now, the process of healing and my own ongoing need for what King calls self-purification and I think of as tshuva, his questions bang at the inner chambers of my heart. Will we be extremists for hate or for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice or for the extension of justice?
I, like every Black person in America, am extremely thankful to Dr. King for all of his work during his time and how his legacy has served as inspiration for tons of important activism and work since then. But another amazing thing that I think is something to really appreciate about Dr. King is how his message can really apply to all communities, all people, and how he focused on unity and bringing everyone together. He once said that we will either live together as brothers or we will perish together as fools. And I think that's a really valuable message that can be applied across all different areas, regions, people groups, the importance of unity and harmony and appreciating each other as human beings. And I think that is a very powerful message.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the most influential civil rights leaders and advocates, and his work towards bringing action to push for racial equality are part of his huge legacy. Dr. King once said, "We must learn to live together as brothers or perish together as fools." And I think that is very powerful because to produce meaningful change, you have to work together and hold intentional conversations instead of focusing on the differences, since that will only further divisions and lead to no progress and more hostility. In the past year at the University of Richmond, I had the tremendous honor of being able to put together the Equity Summit with the help of many amazing students, faculty, and staff, where we held important conversations to start and hopefully begin to change our campus culture as well.
Hello, my name is Steve Bessesi, Vice President for Student Development at the University of Richmond, and welcome back to all our University of Richmond students, faculty, and staff as we look to begin classes tomorrow. The special day that is Martin Luther King Day gives us all a sense of pause. Every year I consider this day very special. To me, it's a day of reflection, often full of opportunities for community service or to hear the reflections of others. But I must admit, some years I've reflected on MLK Day with a focus on how far we have come because of his teachings and his work. This year, it's difficult to think of how far we have come, and it's much more about how far we still have to go. Over the past year, we have witnessed incidents that remind us that racism is far from being defeated. We have seen Dr. King's plea for progress through peace be forgotten, resulting in even more tragedy and heartbreak. To me, Dr. King was about love, peace, and equality. Many have been decimated by the incidents this year. There has been an unprecedented loss of life through the pandemic, and many have been called to serve the front lines in very dangerous situations. We remember Dr. King as we determine how we can make a difference amongst so much chaos. The celebration of Martin Luther King's life could not have come at a better time. We have much work to do as a school, community, nation, and world. Today, as we celebrate his life, I hope we can all be invigorated by his basic principles of peace and love and be motivated to continue our own march towards equality.